So to get right into today's session, our speakers today are Michael Thiele and Kris Nichols. I'll just introduce both of them, and then I believe that Kris is going ahead with her presentation first. Dr. Kris Nichols is a leader in the movement to regenerate soils for healthy crops, food, people, and the planet. She is the research director at Myland Company, LLC. She is also the founder and principal scientist of Kris, Knowledge for Regeneration and Innovation in Soils, Systems Education and Consultation, research consultant with Canadian Organic Growers, soil microbiology research advisor with the Food Water Wellness Foundation, and research director with Carbon Sink. She is also working with Dr. Arjun Makhijani, and I'm sorry about the pronunciation of that. I should have verified that pronunciation before starting here. President of the Institute for Energy and Environmental Research on a project combining regenerative agriculture and renewable energy. RARE is the acronym for that. To reduce the economic risks in transitioning to regenerative agriculture, Kris participates on the Land Use and Agriculture Task Force for the HRH Sustainable Markets Initiative, Advisory Board for the Real Organic Project, Scientific Advisory Board with the Savory Institute's Ecological Outcome Verification Program, and as a soil science advisor with Health First. Previously, Dr. Nichols was the chief scientist at Rodale Institute and research soil soil in brackets microbiologist with the USDA Agricultural Research Service, the ARS. And Michael Thiele was born and raised in Dauphin, Manitoba, on a typical prairie farm. Wheat, canola, and canola dominated the crop rotation with some barley, oats, and peas. A small herd of cows grazed the unfarmed acres. Michael's career trajectory was likely farming, given his active involvement in the family farm and his decision to study plant science in the Faculty of Agriculture at the University of Manitoba. Rather than returning to the family farm after graduating university, however, Michael began a 30-plus year journey to understand agriculture and the importance of soil, water, sunlight, plants, and animals, and the realization that all parts are interconnected, a concept critical to the long-term success of food production and the health of the biosphere. Over that time, Michael has worked with many conservation organizations focused on soil, water, and wildlife habitat in the context of prairie agriculture. More recently, Michael has also worked directly with producers to build regenerative agriculture plans that are designed to rebuild degraded soils and restore farm profitability. So Kris, if you're ready, if you'd like to go ahead with your presentation, I'll just welcome Kris to the floor here.
Up and running. There we go. So I want to thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this very important class and learning experience. As you can see from my introduction, education is a very important thing for me, and I really appreciate the opportunities to be able to provide some information about regenerating soil and looking at it from a very microbial perspective. So this is sort of a microbial story to how we're going to be able to regenerate soil and how that's going to affect emissions reduction and climate change at the same time. And so what I want to talk a little bit about is just giving you some background of regenerative agriculture. These are it's a systems approach to utilizing agriculture, utilizing biologically based tools in which we're going to have an innovative, integrated, and dynamic system that is going to be responsive to the various types of conditions or events that are occurring, both from a climate perspective as well as from market perspectives, so that you've got the flexibility and the resiliency to be able to respond to those types of conditions. Because what you're building on is soil organic matter, and soil organic matter, the carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen of soil, is really what has created soil. So carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen bound to the mineral matrix of sand, silt, and clay is the definition of soil. And we're going to utilize soil microbial community, the biodiversity, and the numbers of organisms that you have in the soil by utilizing holistic farming and grazing practices to really build up those communities. And when we're doing this, we're not going to be focusing on the issues that you might be having because we're going to build up the resiliency of the system, but we're going to focus on the true problem that we have in agriculture. And I believe that the one true problem we have in agriculture is that we don't have enough soil. We don't have enough carbon. And so how is it that we are going to put more carbon below ground? And when we do that, that's going to help to improve the water cycle and the fertility of the system, which is going to help to reduce the emissions that are coming from the soil. So we reduce some of our nitrous oxide emissions and some of our methane emissions that come from adding synthetic fertilizers, as well as the CO2 emissions that are part of the generation of the inputs that we're putting into the system. We're also going to enhance the resilience against pest and disease relationships, which again is automatically going to help to reduce the emissions that come from the production and the application of various types of pesticides. And at the same time, we're going to improve the nutritive quality of the products that we're producing. And we're going to do this by tapping into the power of photosynthesis, basically looking at the energy flow from the sun through carbon into plants, microbes, and animals. And it's all about sort of this carbon trade-off analysis that we're doing. And when we do this as well, this is going to have an impact on emissions reduction and climate change because the soils are the largest deposit of carbon on the planet. So as we put that carbon below ground, that is going to be a way in which we're going to be able to store that carbon for decades to centuries to millennia. And what we're going to be looking at in a regenerative system, again, it's a system where you have these interwoven complex relationships that are really going to be following some very simple patterns, but it's the complexity of the diversity of the organisms that's important to be looking at this. And then thinking about how all organisms follow some basic biological principles and designs in order to be able to create an effective regenerative system. Again, what we're trying to do here is really focus on regenerating soils. We're going to be growing carbon. And when we do that, we're basically going to be utilizing various types of principles to be able to do this. And we've talked a lot, you've probably heard a lot about the various types of soil health principles. Some people talk about 4 soil health principles, some people talk about 5. I've actually got 6 soil health principles listed here. And when these soil health principles that are here, the reason that I use 6 is again because I'm looking at it from the perspective of a microbe. How would a microbe uh, be impacted by the various types of tools that you can put into place to address these principles? I've also put these principles in this graphic. I have them in what I refer to as a pyramid design. And the idea of putting them into a pyramid design is if you think of the architecture of pyramids, every block that was laid in the pyramid played a role. And the blocks are the various types of tools that you can put into place to address the principles that exist there. But in this pyramid design, it's the blocks and the tools that are important. It's not that you have the capstone or the base that's more important than any other layers that are there. The pyramids have stood for thousands of years. I want your farm or ranch to be able to stand for thousands of years. I don't want you to just celebrate century anniversaries. I want you to be able to celebrate millennial anniversaries with your, the future generations in looking at how we're going to be able to stay on the land, because you do the most important job for civilization. We all, directly or indirectly, all work for food. We've all been, as Coral said before, we're all eaters. We've all worked for food in this process. And so how it is that we're going to be able to get that food is what you do. And so being able to make your farm ranch or millennia is what's key in this process. And when I think about the principles, sometimes it's hard. Like I said, there's 4 of them, there's 5 of them, there's 6 of them. What does this all really mean? How is it that we're going to be addressing these principles? And so sometimes an easier way that I find to focus in on it is to treat the soil like it's human, to treat the soil like we're supposed to treat ourselves. And in order for us to be healthy organisms, I said all of these organisms follow some very simple patterns. We're all eaters. We're all consumers. Whether you're a single-celled bacterium or a multicellular cow or a multicellular human being, we're all eaters and consumers. We all have worked for food. And in order for us to be healthy, one of the things that as consumers of food we're supposed to do is we're supposed to be grazers. We're supposed to be eating small meals throughout the day. We're not supposed to go through these cycles of feast or famine. And so what does this mean when we're applying it to soil? Well, what this means when we're applying it to soil is that we need to have almost a continuous influx of carbon into the soil environment. And so often what we've done in our cropping systems is we only have a 90 to 120 to 130 day cropping season. And that's what we've told ourselves. Throughout Canada, you're looking at saying, well, this is the limit that I have. I'm limited by my frost-free days. And so that's going to make it difficult for me to be able to be growing something longer. And what we really need to be doing is you're not looking at growing a cash crop for 365 days, but how is it that you might be able to be growing some other crops? So, you know, we started this off by looking at the temperatures we've had recently with this polar vortex. And obviously, you know, when you have some sustained below zero temperatures, you're not going to be having a plant that's going to be functioning. But what we can look to is look to some of the plants that were growing communities or some of the first colonizers to be able to see what we might be able to do to extend our growing season. I believe that in Canada, we should be looking at having a growing season, growing plants, not growing all crash crops to full productivity, but growing plants for a minimum of 260 days. And you can easily do that. If you think about it, when we're thinking about it, the sun shines 365 days of the year throughout most of Canada. I realize that in the Northern Territories, there's probably periods of time where you don't have sunlight shining 365 days of the year, but through most of Canada, we have the sun shining for 365 days of the year. If we're trying to grow soil and trying to put carbon below ground using photosynthesis, we need to be harvesting sunlight as many days as we possibly can. So if I tell you that you can grow something for 260 days, that means you're taking a 105-day vacation. You're starving the soil for 105 days. The more that we can reduce that period of time, the more that we're going to improve the health of the soil system. So the other thing that we want to do in order to be healthy organisms is we want to eat a diverse diet. Now, what's great about this is if you're extending your growing season for 260 days, you're automatically going to add diversity because you're going to have different plants that you're going to have to put in the soil. You're going to have to grow different crops in order to be able to achieve that 260 days. So one sort of principle or one idea, one concept automatically helps with the other one. So again, as we're trying to improve the health and the quality of soil, we're looking at being able to focus in on that. And what that's going to do is that's going to help to put carbon below ground. It's going to help us to be able to generate an environment in which we can actually originate soil again. What we're going to do is we're going to look at how soil was first formed. So when we think about this, we didn't have soil to begin with. When the planet Earth first evolved, there wasn't soil. There was water and there was land. And the land was made up of mineral rock, of sand, silt, and clay. And so you had the sand, silt, and clay, but you didn't have the carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, the organic matter that makes soil soil. And so what ended up happening is in the aquatic environment where life evolved, you had a fungus, and the fungal body are basically these long, fine threads. And the long fine threads, the idea of having those threads is that you have what's called a greater surface area to volume ratio, which means you're going to have in that thread, you're going to have more of your surface of that thread be in contact with the environment around you. And in an aquatic environment, you had the nutrients that you needed to be able to grow. The mineral nutrients were dissolved in that aquatic environment, but they were very diffuse in that aquatic environment. So when you have these long, fine threads with a greater surface area, they can come in contact with more of those mineral nutrients. But the fungus couldn't make carbon. So it was starving for carbon, even though it had all of the mineral nutrients that it needed. But you had a photosynthetic bacterium that actually could make carbon, that could do photosynthesis. And so what ended up happening was that single-celled bacterium, instead of having a good surface area to volume ratio, where you had good exposure to that aquatic environment, you had a single cell that now had to try and absorb the nutrients from that environment. So they decided to work together. And when they worked together, the fungus would go and be able to absorb more nutrients that the bacterium needed to make the enzymes to do photosynthesis. And the bacterium would do photosynthesis, fix carbon into sugars, and some of those carbon sugars would then go to feed the fungus. And because they both were satisfied for the needs that they had and did that very efficiently, it allowed them to grow and replicate very, very quickly. So their population grew in this aquatic environment. Now, when you're in an aquatic environment, you are going to, part of you, some of you are going to eventually wash up on shore onto the land. And on that mineral land, you're going to, just as we see what happens with tides, you're going to wash up to about the same spots all the time. And so they started, their population was growing into very large numbers in the aquatic environment, and they started to wash up on shore into the same area. And when they washed up on shore into the same area, they would start to pile on top of each other. And when you're piled on top of each other and you're a photosynthetic bacterium at the bottom of the pile, you can't do photosynthesis anymore because you're blocked from sunlight. So you do a different job now. And the job that those bottom bacteria evolved into was basically creating roots. And so the roots were an anchoring structure. So as the bacterium piled on top of each other and started to evolve into a plant, you had it that the plant wouldn't fall over. It had the roots to anchor it and to brace it in that environment. And connected within those roots was still this fungus. Now the fungus's job wasn't so much to have the long fungal hyphae to go out there and pick up nutrients in a very diffuse mineral environment like there was in the aquatic environment. Now there were a lot of nutrients that were in the mineral environment, but they were in rock and in that mineral environment that they weren't readily available to the plant. So the fungus now started working with other fungi and bacteria to help to break down that mineral environment. We see this today with lichens growing on rocks, that they break down that mineral environment. Lichens are an algal fungal relationship. You had photosynthesis, you had the fungus that would break down that mineral environment, release the nutrients that the algal organism, the algae, needed to be able to do photosynthesis. The same thing happened with these very first land plants. So essentially, we had no soil without plants and no land plants without fungi. So we had to have this relationship together. You can see in the black and white pictures, they're pictures of mycorrhizal fungi and fossilized roots. And then in the colored picture that's blue, that is actually mycorrhizal fungi that's inside roots, and I stained blue several years ago. But you can see that their structures look very similar. So the fungus didn't have to change the way that it looked in the same way the bacterium changed to create roots and to create stalks and leaves and flowers and things like that in creating plants. The fungus stayed very much in the same way as far as its body structure because it was very efficient at being able to get the nutrients from the soil and deliver those back to the plant. And that efficiency is really key to, as we look at trying to reduce costs, to try and reduce costs financially as well as environmental and ecosystem services costs and reduce emissions. That is important to have us utilize the most efficient processes evolved to be able to get these things happening at a high level of efficiency. And again, we're going to be focusing on photosynthesis. And we really, I want to emphasize again this efficiency thing, because photosynthesis, that photosynthetic activity, is the most efficient form of solar energy conversion to chemical energy in the bonds between carbon atoms and carbon atoms, or carbon atoms and other atoms. And the idea here is that, again, we're doing something that is incredibly efficient. And when we are trying to create a system that is going to help us to regenerate or originate soil, we need to have a system in which we're going to have photosynthesis that's going to allow for this great influx of energy into the environment. And almost all life on planet Earth is carbon based. Directly or indirectly, we get that carbon and the energy to do work from photosynthesis. I say almost all life because we do have silica-based organisms called diatoms, where their bodies are formed from silica, but they still need the energy to do chemical reactions that comes from sunlight, directly and indirectly, utilizing that to basically put that stored solar energy into the chemical bonded energy. So we all need to have photosynthetic activity. And the more we can have this, the better off we are going to be. As we look at soil organic matter and how it is that we're going to regenerate soil, we start off with saying, well, organic matter is a very small portion of the soil. I said soil is, it started off with the mineral rock, the sand, silt, and clay. But then you had this organic component that actually made it soil. And that organic component may be a very small percentage of the overall mass of the soil itself, but that organic component controls about 95% of the activities, the function of soil itself. So we want to be able to have those organisms that are there that are going to be able to help us, that soil microbial community that's going to help us to be able to allow for those activities. In that soil organic matter, you have the microbial biomass, you have what's called the stable humus fraction that usually we thought of being formed over several hundred to thousands of years. And then you have the labile fraction that is sort of your annual influx of carbon. Now, one of the things that we have found is that by working with the organisms that are in the soil, having these complex communities existing there, we can actually transform that labile carbon that comes in on an annual basis from growing plants, that's in the root biomass, that's in the plant tissue above ground, that's in the exudates that's coming off of the roots. The microbial community is going to work in this complex consortia to basically add more carbon into the environment by keeping more of that carbon stabilized. So they're going to biologically, physically, and chemically occlude proteins and carbohydrates that are part of that labile fraction and make them stable for a longer period of time. So we can actually now start to grow soil. When you look at the pictures here, this comes from a 2017 paper, and what these pictures here are showing or illustrating these complex consortia that can exist. So the size of the spheres are the actual size, the number of species that are within these different groups. So bacteria are the most numerous as far as the number of different species. On a biomass level, the fungi have fewer species, but because they're those long, fine threads, primarily that's their body structure, they are the largest biomass of the microbial communities. So what you've got here are the bacteria and the fungi, and you've got a bunch of different types of mites and nematodes and earthworms. You've got plants, you've got all of these different organisms that are involved here, and they're all connected into these different lines that are connecting them in these different relationships. Now, I said the size of the spheres indicates the number of species that are there. The width of the line indicates the number of different types of relationships that can exist. And the first graph that you'll see there, the first illustration that you see there, basically what that's showing is what's kind of happening in a conventional types of a system, where you do have these organisms and there are relationships there, but the lines aren't as great. The strength of those relationships isn't quite as strong, and the size of the spheres are a little bit smaller. Now, as we go to more regenerative-based systems, the communities are going to, the size, the numbers of the organisms are going to grow much larger, and the lines are going to grow wider. And then we're also adding some color to these lines. So this is what this is going to mean, is as we look at this, the width of the line, so the wide bar that's connecting the fungi and the bacteria indicates that there's about 9,000 different types of interactions between fungi and bacteria. And then the smaller that the width of the line gets, the more that those numbers of interactions decrease. So for many of these organisms, you only have about 30 different types of interactions that are going to be happening. If you look at the color of the lines, one of the things that this indicates is the percentage of the interaction between the two groups, or sort of the strength in which these groups are interrelated. Now, one of the things that I want you to notice is that the bacteria and the fungi are very strongly connected to some of the mites. And the reason that this exists this way is that the mites, just like us, have a gut microbiome. And in that gut microbiome, you have fungi and bacteria that are actually processing the materials that are eaten by, that are consumed by the mites. So they're going to chew that up just like we do. You have to be a good chewer. If you're not a good chewer, you're going to have a stomach ache. If you don't chew your food well, your mother was right. You have to chew your food well so you don't have a stomach ache. And the reason is because you want to produce little bit of tiny pieces for your gut microbiome, for the fungi and the bacteria in your gut to be able to attack and be able to break down. And then what goes into your bloodstream, or what goes into the bodies of the mites or insects or other animals, is the broken down materials, the waste that's released by the bacteria and the fungi. So again, you can see the strength of those relationships that exist there in order to be able to get an understanding of how complex this environment is. When we look at this complexity, we're looking at ways in which we're going to be able to support this microbial consortia that you have here. And I'm going to go to the next slide, which is kind of going to blow this up. And we're just going to take a look. This is actually a high magnification. This is a high magnification view of the ciliates, which we saw previously. And so we've got more ciliates, we've got flagellates, you've got algae that are in here, you've got all of these different types of organisms, paramecia, you've got rotifers and nematodes, all of these organisms existing in this environment. And they're all going to be working together to, again, in these complex consortia, to create a great place for them all to live. So this, the pictures that are at the top here, one of the pictures is from, both of these pictures are taken from a trip that I was taking to Glasgow, Montana, up near the Canadian border near Alberta. And what we had here was, on one side of the road, we had a field that had been tilled for a number of years. And on the other side of the road, we had a field that was a no-till. And what you can see here is that you've got the soil basically has been lost. There is no carbon left in the field that has been tilled. But in the field that is in the no-till system, you see that you've got soil that's there. And it isn't just the fact that tillage is important, and that's what the graph below shows, is we saw a big reduction, we saw a loss. When we do tillage, we see a hemorrhaging of carbon, of soil from the environment, a hemorrhaging of carbon, and that carbon is part of the soil. So we see a hemorrhaging of soil from the environment with tillage. Now, when we go to a no-till system or a reduced till system, we are seeing some gains in carbon, but we're not seeing enough gains in carbon, because one of the things that we also need to include into these regenerative systems is, again, going back to talking about how we originated soil, being able to have more photosynthetic activity. So what we're doing within regenerative systems is we're coupling reduced tillage with increasing photosynthetic activity. And we're doing that by having plants that are growing in polycrop systems, in relay crop systems, double cropping, perennials and annuals, all of these different types of things. And at the same time, we're also integrating animals into the system because the animals are going to stimulate the plants to produce more exudates. And that's going to build up more, those exudates are carbon-based compounds, and that's going to build up more of our, sorry, my fingers are hitting. Keep my hand still. I like to gesture, I apologize. But that's going to help us to be able to build up more of that rich soil that we're looking for. So we want to be able to have the carbon influx, and then we want to make sure that the microbial communities are not destroyed by tillage events, that the microbes themselves are some of the microbes that are part of the consortia are not killed by various types of pesticides, including insecticides and fungicides. We want to make sure that we're actually creating an environment where it is nice for the microbes to be able to live and where they have a lot of the food that they need to be able to live. And that goes back to treating the soil like you want to treat yourself. You want to make sure that you're not going through periods of feast or famine. You want to make sure that you're actually protecting that soil environment by having mulches or crop residues or living plants that are going to be growing on that soil environment to protect it from erosive forces. You want to make sure that you are having diversity in the types of plants that you're growing. And you want to make sure that you exercise. And part of the exercise that we're going to be doing is reducing some of the inputs that we put into the system so that the microbes have a job. If we add a lot of fertilizers, that is outsourcing the jobs from the microbial community, because part of the role of many of the organisms in the soil, just like I talked about with originating soil with the mycorrhizal fungi, helping to provide those mineral nutrients, is that they are actually providing the nutrients that the plant needs. If we add a lot of those nutrients, the plant doesn't feed carbon to the microorganisms, and so they aren't able to grow and reproduce. If we add a lot of pesticides, we reduce not just the populations and the diversity of the organisms that are killed by the pesticides, but many of the organisms are also involved in managing pest and disease relationships. And so we're going to lose that activity as well. So we want to have some stressors. We want to do some exercise, but we don't want to over exercise. We don't want to do this to the point of injury. So we're really looking, I'm going to go back to this, because what we want to do is really treat the soil like we need to treat ourselves. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Michael, and he's going to talk about some of the more practical things that he does on his farm.
Okay, all right. Thanks, Kris. That was great, of course. You know, Kris has been a huge influence on a lot of people, and I first met her when she was in North Dakota, and has been a large influence on some of the more influential producers in regenerative ag, like Gabe Brown and so on. So and she continues to do lots of good work. So let's get set up here. All right, well, glad to be here. Thanks to the NFU and Darren for inviting me to speak on agriculture and some of the new directions. Some of them are new, some of them are old ideas that are new again. And so this is a little bit of an experiment, and I mentioned this to Darren. I was been thinking about some of these ideas, the regenerative principles, and I got thinking about something that I've called a regenerative algorithm, and it's sort of a bit of a thought experiment. I'm using the term algorithm kind of in the spirit of all the talk nowadays about AI and machine learning and neural networks and all that good stuff that's supposed to reshape the world and the good things that can bring. I use algorithm kind of more in a simple idea. If anyone's done any programming, you build a flow chart when you want to program, do something. And so I'm using the algorithm in kind of that sort of spirit as a process, a flow, a set of instructions, or rules, and I'll get to that because I think rules are important. So let me know what your comments, your thoughts are after this. I'd appreciate that. So thanks. So just to give a little bit of context, this is an aerial of the part of Manitoba where I grew up and still live. So you'll see on the north side of Rocky Mountain National Park, and I'm sure some of you have been there. Rocky Mountain National Park is this little bump, hardly a mountain, but it's a little bump on the prairies that the last glacier left behind. And I grew up on a small mixed farm west of Dauphin, and I now live on the other side of the park at Shoal Lake. So I've spent my life kind of around this interesting geological formation, and growing up, on the farm, I had this sense. So I could always see the park when I looked south. It was very visible in the horizon, and it sort of guided my sense of direction. It was difficult to get lost. You always just had to look south, and there it was. But I had this sense that that's where nature was. But out here where we're doing farming, we're trying to make a living, we don't have time for nature. And no one told me that. That was just something that somehow I absorbed into my thinking. And it took a long time to kind of realize that was a bit sort of, slightly psychopathic, and kind of working through all that growing up on a small mixed farm. And I'll tell one quick story. As a little guy, of course, you want to be on the tractor as soon as possible. And you're 9, 10 years old, you can hardly press the clutch in, but you want to get out there. And so dad was like, all right, go do the summer follow, right? You can't get into too much trouble. Just take it easy, right? Don't take out the fence lines, which of course you do because you're learning. But anyhow, eventually I got tired of doing that. And I kind of asked dad, it's like, well, why am I doing this, right? Why am I doing the summer follow? And the answer was, well, you're giving the land a rest, just like you need a rest. I was like, oh, okay, that makes sense. The truth of it is now that story is incorrect, and that kind of set me on this path of trying to figure out how this thing called agriculture worked. So that's a little bit of a background. Right. So why a regenerative algorithm? Like, why bother doing this? We have the principles, and we'll go over them real quick too. And Kris talked about them. But what I found is, producers do have a bit of a struggle to incorporate these principles into their decision making. Difficult to memorize. For example, I'm working on a project with General Mills. We got 45 farms across Manitoba, Saskatchewan, North Dakota. So, it's a fairly large project. And almost every conversation that I have with these producers, whether it's now by Zoom or in the past, you're out in the field, you're digging around in the soil, and it's like, hey, let's go over the principles. And they can maybe come up with 2 or 3 if they think for a while and kind of sort of, but it's hard. So I thought, well, maybe there's a better way to kind of do all this. And so I'll show you that. We'll get to that. But so it's been interesting to sort of watch all the people on these farms. So it's not just the main producer, it's the whole family on their journey to kind of understand these ideas and incorporate them into their decision making and their management on their farms. But this whole thing doesn't happen in a vacuum. There's a reason why we're talking about regenerative. Regenerative means to rebuild, to regenerate, right? And you don't regenerate something that isn't degraded. So we do now have a situation where our resources are highly degraded, our ecosystems are highly degraded, and people will ask, well, what, for example? Well, soil, of course, is the first one. I'm here in Manitoba, kind of southwest Manitoba, and on Newdale clay loam, it's the provincial soil, and wonderful fertile soil, or it was. Probably historically was 10, 12, 14% organic matter. Most of it now is between 2 and 4, right? So we've lost probably 50 to 75% of the carbon in that system, and the consequences to that, the loss of diversity, you know, and consequences to water. So there's a long list. So we need to fix some of these things. So part of what I'm doing is just assisting producers on that journey, helping them to grow and to and make their farms better. And so I'm working for a little group called Understanding Ag, and I'll mention a little more about that. What's interesting though is some of these organizations like General Mills, Cargill, there's a bunch now are starting to talk about and making announcements and putting money into these ideas. And you know, we'll see how it all works out. But for example, you know, Cargill made a big announcement last September, and it does bring some legitimacy, especially with conventional farmers that sort of wonder about these new ideas. So what the algorithm is it's basically trying to put the principles into a diagram, and hopefully it's a useful decision-making tool. And we'll see. So some of the work I'm doing is with this cool little group called Understanding Ag. There's not many of us in Canada. There's maybe 3 of us. And it's small in total anyways, but it's mainly a US company. It's some of you may know their names. The main partners are Gabe Brown, Dr. Alan Williams, Ray Archuleta, and Shane New. And it's a great little group, and I feel very fortunate to be working with them. And I'd say check out the website, Understanding Ag. There's lots of good stuff. We've done quite a few webinars, just good information. You know, there's a reason why we've called ourselves Understanding Ag, is we've realized that only through a deeper understanding will we make meaningful change. What is really interesting is you can make a case that Understanding Ag is maybe the largest ecological organization in North America. You know, of course, we're working with producers, and many would say we're simply a, you know, an ag organization. But in my mind, we're much more than that. And we're now working on over 20 million acres in North America. And if you think about that, we're basically working on these farms to implement these ecological ideas. So we're small, but we're working on a large area. And that's on a company that's only a couple of years old. So if we just go quickly over the regenerative principles, like Kris mentioned, she has 6. This is the 6 that we're using at Understanding Ag. And so most of them are the same. We put context in the middle, and context is simply things like, what is your context with ecology, with your environment on the farm? What's your relationship with your bank and finances, with your community, with your spirituality, with your understanding of these ideas? So all of these things are in the context of that. And context, of course, is an important concept when you start talking about systems theory. And then the other 5 main principles, in my mind, top of the list is green plants, living roots. And we're going to go through all this much more in a minute here. Integrate livestock, minimize disturbance, soil armor, keep the ground covered, and diversity, right? Diversity is basically, like in any organization, you need a diversity of talent. Same with ecosystems. When you have diversity, each functional group in that system, whether you're talking about soil biology or whatever, has a job to do. And if they're not there, those jobs may not get done. I remember I asked Kris this question. We did a webinar with Kris back in the spring, and I asked, you know, is there possibility to have extinction events where you lose like a functional group out of the soil? And she was like, yeah, that's possible. But what's interesting is there's this resilience or redundancy, like kind of like the space shuttle, where the space shuttle has like 3 computer systems, right? The first one goes down, there's a backup. If the backup goes down, there's a backup to the back. And it's the same thing in nature, where you have this redundancy where other functional groups can kind of pitch in. And I thought that was sort of a hopeful story. So those basically are the regenerative principles. Minimize disturbance. That is talking about a number of things. Tillage is a disturbance, mechanical disturbance. There can also be chemical disturbances, fertilizer, herbicides, fungicides, insecticides. All these things can be a disturbance. And then Kris mentioned it quickly too, is it's okay to have disturbance in the sense of like, her analogy with fitness where, you don't do the same workout over and over and over. You mix it up, disturbance, to sort of tweak the system to make it stronger, whether it's a muscle or an ecosystem. But in the same sense, if you do something and you overuse it and it's chronic, then you have issues, right? Just like in, say, with our own health, when you have ongoing inflammation and that becomes like say an autoimmune disorder, it's the same with ecosystems. So we have to be careful not to have chronic disturbance. Okay, come on. There we go. So if we look at the definitions of regenerative agriculture, just want to make the point that we're not just talking about soil here. We're talking about regenerating farms and regenerating communities. There's a reason why our small towns are drying up and blowing away. It's because all the money's getting sucked out of them, right? And part of this regenerative ag is to try to keep these communities healthy by, finding ways to keep the money in these communities. So we're much more than just about soil. So here's a couple examples. This is Gabe Brown's, and his definition of regenerative ag: renewal of food and farming systems, aims to regenerate topsoil, increase biodiversity, improve mineral, carbon, water cycles, while improving on and on, right? You're not going to memorize that, is my point. Here's one by Ray. I just received this from him, and it's great. I'm not criticizing the content of it. It's actually all good stuff, but it's just a lot, right? So his goes on and on, talks about the principles, renewal of heart and mind, good stuff that transforms, right? In some ways, this is about hearts and minds much more than it is about, say, science, right? It's about people. Conscientious agriculture. I like that word, that we need to be intentional about how we're doing these things. Collaborative relationship between nature and humans, all good stuff, right? Wikipedia, again, goes on and on, talks about topsoil and diversity and ecosystems, and it's good stuff. And the reason I'm going through all this is I was at a meeting where there started to be a bit of a discussion about, what is this regenerative ag thing, and got me thinking. So here's my definition. It's just simply the rules of nature. And that's what we sort of call biomimicry, right? And it's just sort of accepting that there are kind of rules, sort of like sideboards, kind of like playing hockey, there's sideboards within which you play the game. It's kind of the same. And if we choose to ignore those rules, there's consequences, right? And I think we're sort of finding that out. And, the example that I use is gravity, right? You wake up in the morning and you decide that you don't believe in gravity, okay? And you jump off a tall building. Does gravity care that you chose to ignore? No, right? It's going to be a hard landing. In the same sense, we're kind of doing that in agriculture, where we're kind of ignoring biology and ecology and systems theory and all that. We're starting to kind of understand all that. But we have kind of ignored that in a sense, and simply kind of used chemistry, the Green Revolution. And it's not like it hasn't been successful in certain ways. Of course, it's fed a lot of people and all that. But there's been sort of we've been enamored with chemistry and ignored biology, is the point of that. And that really comes to this sort of idea of first principles reasoning, right? And that, I think that's what, the important of a principle. It's sort of the basis from which we kind of understand things, right? We build up our reasoning from that solid foundation, and that foundation is basically science, where we observe and we experiment and we come up with, like you say, like for example, there is a law of gravity where we kind of have done enough to know that this is sort of how it works, and it seems to work that way throughout the universe. And so we're not necessarily looking for truth. Science doesn't get you closer to truth, but it does always get you a deeper understanding, and then we can use that to guide our decision making, and then to question the assumptions or conventions that we build up over time, the culture, and just continue to ask why to help us to do a better job. So if you look at it, this is a 10,000-year-old problem roughly, that we've had agriculture as best as we know. And I'm being critical, but I'm not trying to judge, but I'm just trying to help have a deeper understanding, and that we must be humble. There's so much yet to learn, and that our past and present stewardship is just basically a reflection of our understanding, right? And if we can have a deeper understanding, we can tell a more complete story. And I think if I've had one small insight in my life, I would say that many of the stories we tell ourselves in agriculture, it's not like they're incorrect, but they're incomplete. And that this is sort of helps us to have a more complete understanding of what we're up to. So with that kind of background, so this is sort of like version 1.0 of what I call this regenerative algorithm, right? This was maybe a year or so ago. I kind of was trying to just figure this out in my own mind. And, it starts with the sun and then the plant, photosynthesis, right? And through the miracle of photosynthesis, the plant converts CO2 and water to carbon, and that is pumped into the soil to feed the biology, to provide mineral to that whole relationship, to then build soil aggregation, and all that ultimately is profit. And then so it goes, right? And so that I thought that was okay. But then I just kept sort of thinking about it, and this is kind of it. I know it's a lot, but we'll kind of go through this and try to understand this. So I'm just going to get my notes here so I don't miss too much here. So it all starts with, of course, the sun, right? And this is something I came to understand more deeply by reading Darren's book, Civilization Critical. And I tell you, I'd recommend you pick up a copy and read it. It's a nice kind of summary of our predicament, and it goes through and kind of talks about energy and ecology and money and all that, and agriculture, food. So really in farming, there is only one meaningful form of energy, and that's sunlight. It's not diesel fuel. It's not natural gas to make nitrogen fertilizer. It's simply sunlight, solar energy. And when we start to understand that, everything kind of changes. And when we think about, say, diesel fuel, that's just ancient sunlight anyways, right? So it's all the same thing. It's sunlight. And so when we don't have a green plant, and again, this is something Kris had mentioned, then we have no energy. We have no energy flow. And when you look at this now globally, so this is kind of the link to things like climate, and we have cut down great forests and tilled up the grasslands to grow grain. And in the process, we've probably reduced photosynthetic capture on the planet by half, roughly, the best that I've seen. And there's a great paper called Space Earth Battery, where they go through and kind of make this, they basically look at the planet as it's like a battery. The Earth is a battery that's being trickle charged by the sun all day, every day, right? That sun's shining. But it needs, of course, a green plant photosynthesis to drive that. And if you look at what's currently happening with loss of green plants growing, whether it's trees or grass or what have you, we've cut that capture of sunlight, which of course captures CO2 in the process of photosynthesis. So we've probably reduced carbon sequestration globally by about half every year, from roughly 250 billion tons of carbon, say 10,000 years ago, to half that today. So think of the consequences of that. So think about that in our own context, or at least my context here, whoever's out here on the prairies. I know we have people from all over. We've tilled up the northern Great Plains, the Canadian prairies, to grow wheat and canola. And that used to be basically a big pasture where you had perennial grasses and forbs and legumes, diversity, and grazing animals, millions of grazing animals. And now you have wheat and canola, spring seeded plants, nothing green growing April. It's May before the seed's in the ground. It's well into June before there's something green and growing. It's end of June, early July before that field is canopied and really rocking and rolling. So you basically have a system where you used to have over 200 days of solar capture. You now have maybe 50 or 60. And that has consequences over time for all sorts of things, not just climate, but soil. So in my mind, this is where it all starts. And when you're trying to make decisions as a producer, this should be your goal. Green plant living root in the ground as many days as possible. And if you don't, you have a system that's starving, like Kris said, because what happens is, now let's continue. So photosynthesis, CO2 and water produces liquid carbon exudates, which the plant pumps into the soil. You may wonder why that would happen. Well, of course, it's the relationship where the plant is feeding the biology. I got these little bugs down here, critters. So the plant feeds the biology, and I'm talking about this in simple terms here now. And then the biology gives the plant nutrients, mineral. And if you want to look up something that's super interesting, this word I have at the bottom, rhizophogy, is incredibly interesting, where what can happen in the case of, say, a bacteria, the bacteria are attracted to the rhizosphere, the area around the root where the plant is exuding these carbon compounds to feed the biology. Like basically carbon is energy for the plant, for the biology, the bugs, the bacteria and the fungi. And those bacteria can actually enter into between the cell walls of the root, into the root and into the plant, where they undergo superoxides that the plant produces that degrades the cell wall, and the plant literally like sucks the protoplasm out of the cell, high in nutrient, and that's actually how the plant uptakes a good portion of its nutrient. The bacteria can then reform its cell wall and exit back into the soil to do it all over again. So it's a cycle, right? Extremely interesting. And they're called endophytes. And most people, and it was same with me, the only knowledge they have of endophytes is endophyte-free fescue. I mean, we think of endophytes as bad guys, but endophytes are basically any biology that enters into the plant. And quorum sensing also extremely interesting, where the plant and the soil biology communicate. For example, the plant may say through chemical sensors or biomolecules exuded, and say to the biology, I need phosphorus. And the biology will say, well, sure, I'll give you some phosphorus, but in exchange, I want some carbon. So there's a relationship, right? And communication. That can all get busted when we hijack that process by adding synthetic fertilizer, which I have here as just NPK. So what happens here is we can bust this entire process unknowingly, right? Again, not being critical in a right or wrong way, just that, that now we have this understanding. So what happens when we add high levels of NPK, we kind of bust this process and the plant goes, yeah, okay, I don't need you guys. And the biology goes, well, okay, I guess, we have nothing better to do. So we'll go, play Xbox and smoke dope in the basement, right? Instead of getting to work to do this job. And so you get this broken relationship, because you can simply ask yourself the question, who fertilized the prairies for the past 10,000 years, right? Nobody. It was simply done through this process. And I also have TNE here. TNE means total nutrient extraction. On those 45 farms in the General Mills project, we tested down to 1 foot the total mineral in that soil profile. And I'm talking total, available, unavailable. It's a harsh acid extraction to look at the total pool of minerals in the parent material, 1 foot deep. Nitrogen, on average over those 45 farms, 7,000 pounds of nitrogen, just in the top foot. What about the second foot and the third, right? Phosphorus, 2,200 pounds. Potassium, 11,000 pounds, and on and on and on. We tested all the macros, a bunch of the micros. There were no zeros across any of those. There's lots of nutrient. I'm not advocating for just mining out all the, but the point is to say that we're not deficient in nutrient. What we are deficient in is a system where it's functioning and a little bit is made available to drive this system, right? But does the plant need 100 pounds of N on day one when you plant the seed, like say wheat or canola, right? Where we're planting 100 pounds of N? No, of course not, right? It needs a pound a day for 100 days. So there's this cycle and relationship that's been broken. So, we can work with that knowledge. If you think about it, if we have that much in the top foot, what do we have down 6, 8, 10 feet, right? These prairie soils are very rich in nutrient. So if we move on, one of the jobs that this process does is grow soil. And this is what petrogenesis is. That just basically means to build soil. And how this works is the biology, and Kris could talk much more about that. Some of the work that she did way back in North Dakota, very instrumental in understanding how aggregates fail and how these, especially fungi, mycorrhizal fungi, exude these kind of gluey products that bind the sand, silts, and clays together to form aggregates. So if you look at a healthy soil, and these are sort of my kind of visual way to look at aggregates. And when you look at a healthy soil, it kind of has like a cottage cheesy appearance. It's got these sort of crumbly structures, and it's porous, it's light, it's flat, and because there's room for air and water. When you look at a healthy soil, the sand, silts, and clays, the actual mineral component of the soil is only about half or so. And then there's a little bit of organic matter, maybe 5% plus or minus. The rest is actually just space between that allows room for air and water to move. And when you don't have that aggregation, you don't have infiltration, you end up with things like hard pan, where water can't move down into the soil. And that's caused by things like tillage. That's why I put this tractor up here. There's consequences to tillage. You produce a hard pan or a tillage layer and water can't move. You bust aggregates. As soon as you drag a piece of steel through soil, you introduce air and you start to break down the soil structure, and the biology gets to work to bust that up. And maybe going back here a little bit, it's the bacteria that sometimes get to work. And it's the reason why things like summerfall I mentioned earlier actually kind of work, in the sense that what they did was mineralize out a bit of nitrogen. But what tends to happen is the bacteria get to work and go, well, free nitrogen in whatever form, but they have a carbon nitrogen ratio about 5:1. So every time they grab a nitrogen, they have to grab 5 carbon. And where they typically grab that carbon will be out of the soil. And one of the easiest forms of soil carbon to grab at is those nice aggregates. So they chew up those aggregates, you lose that, you lose that porosity, and then you end up with a soil that lacks infiltration. Then this is sort of the final part of this big cycle, is the water cycle. So now you have a system where, like, think about what we've done over millions of acres of the prairies, where we now have low infiltration. If you look historically about on infiltration rates on prairie soils, it was probably over 10 inches of water per hour. 10 inches. You could take this huge, thunderstorm, rain event, and not have much runoff. Again, those 45 farms that we're studying and looking at, we did infiltration on year 1 as a benchmark. The average infiltration rate on prairie soils cropland is probably less than an inch an hour, maybe half an inch an hour. We've had cases where guys, just for their own information, went out on things like hay fields where you think would be a little better. It's perennial, it's alfalfa, brome grass, whatever. Banged in an infiltration ring, which they needed a sledgehammer to just get it in the ground. Poured in the water, sat there for a couple hours, got bored, had to get some work done. Came back the next day, and there was still water in that. So that's how much we've affected. So imagine over millions of acres, the consequences of that. For things like infrastructure, we have these big storms, now we have flooding and all the rest. It's because the water isn't going into the land, it's running across the land, into the ditch, down the stream, and causes trouble. So the water cycle, highly affected by this whole thing, these huge cycles that are functioning. If we can increase the soil carbon sponge, that's basically just getting more carbon into it. So when we talk about a lot of the problems that we have in ag can be summarized and answered usually by 2 things, carbon or biology. And in the case of carbon, I think we may need to look at it more like cash flow, like any good business has good cash flow. In the same sense, probably any profitable farm, healthy farm has good carbon flow. So there it is. That's my algorithm. There's maybe a little more to say there, but we'll just leave it at that. So what, I've kind of been inspired by things like Leopold, and I think this kind of sums up what we're trying to do with this regenerative thing, is that a thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, the stability, the beauty of the biotic community, right? Biotic, the living community. And it is wrong when it tends otherwise. And those are his words. Again, wrong. I'm not trying to make judgment, but I think what we need to do is do things that are right to grow life, and we're going in the right direction. And that's what regenerative ag tries to do, is work with life, work with nature. So in this sense, when we have things to do to fix, farmers are basically ecological doctors. And this is just a quote I took from Dr. Fred Provenza. And this is talking specifically about grazing. And at the highest level of sophistication, a skilled shepherd is an ecological doctor who has learned to use grazing to produce meat or milk, but to also create environmental health. And I think if there's one thing, this regenerative thing has allowed people to do, and when they're trying to sort of fix problems, is there's been this sort of lack of imagination and creativity in agriculture and in sort of high input industrial ag. And that there's an opportunity here for imagination and creativity. And then just to sum up is, your farm is simply a reflection of you. And it's your management, your understanding, and that is a hopeful story, because with a deeper understanding, you can improve your management and make your farm better, more profitable and more productive. So, thank you.